Welcome. We are starting the Monarch listing proposal and Monarch CCAA webinar. I hope everyone can hear me and see me. Please go to the next slide, Dan. So just some housekeeping before we get started. So everybody is muted. If you have any technical issues or difficulties, please chat into Catherine O'Reilly, one of our staff members, and they should be able to help sort anything out. And we will work with you to make sure that it is as smooth as possible. We are also keeping an eye on our questions and answers box, so keep chatting your questions throughout the webinar, and we have time saved for the end to go through all of your questions. So please submit those, and if we don't get to them by the end of the webinar, we will also follow up with you via email as well. We are also recording this presentation, and so we do have a webpage on our working group website that has all of our webinars recorded. We will work to get this one posted just as soon as we are done with it, and we'll share it afterwards. So no need to panic. We will have it ready for you, as soon as we can. So with that, next slide, thank you. My name is Caroline Hernandez. I am joined by my colleagues today, Dan Salas and Megan Petraitis, and they will also be presenting today. And we've got Catherine O'Reilly and Allison Little on the back end, making sure things run smoothly. For those of you who are not familiar with the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group, we wanted to give you just a brief overview of where this is all coming from and how we've gotten here today. So, Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group started as a grassroots group of energy and transportation organizations coming together and talking to the University of Illinois Chicago, us, about how they wanted to create habitat on their working lands and wanted to share, lessons learned and learn from each other. And so we started convening everybody. And we have been growing, and we are almost now at our 10-year anniversary, which is really exciting. We've been growing from this grassroots, convening of a couple of organizations, and we are now beyond just energy and transportation organizations. We consist of nonprofit organizations, some technical experts, government agencies, from local government to the federal government, and everybody is working together in this working group to enhance and expand habitat. We work to remove those barriers for conservation on energy and transportation infrastructure, and we are working to transform how we look at sustainability on those lands with climate and biodiversity. We have a number of projects that we focus on in terms of research projects, tools and resources, and initiatives, and one of our real and that is part of what we're talking about today. So, of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published their proposal for the Monarch butterfly, and today's webinar is intended to update the Rights of Ways Habitat Working Group on that proposed listing for the Monarch. We're going to share our initial insights on the proposed rule and the implications comments that can be submitted for the next 90 days. The agenda of this webinar on the next slide is essentially doing what I just said. So we're going to be talking about the Monarch listing proposal, the implications of that proposal as we perceive them for energy and transportation lands, the implications of the proposal for the Monarch CCAA. We've got about 20 minutes, hopefully, at the end for questions, and then we'll talk about what's next for the proposal, for the CCAA, for the working group. So I hope you stick around with us for that part as well. Next slide. I do want to mention that today's webinar is being hosted by the University of Illinois, Chicago. We are not the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, nor are we saying anything on behalf of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so the webinar is focused on our opinion and our review of the information that is made available, and does not necessarily reflect the opinions of the service, nor the content of the final decision rule. So please keep that in mind while you listen to us.
All right, thank you, Caroline, and thank you everybody for attending today too. To that point, I do want to note that even though we're not the Fish and Wildlife Service, they have been a great partner through all the work we've been doing with Monarch Butterfly. There's a number of service personnel on the webinar today who are here to help answer questions as we have time for that over the course of the webinar today. So thank you to them for joining, and yeah, with that, we'll talk a little more about what's in the proposal and what it means. So maybe not a surprise to you, monarch butterflies have been a conservation concern for some time. Think about how we got to today. It really started back in 2014 with the initial petition to consider the monarch butterfly for listing. And in the years that followed that, the review and the status assessment that was undertaken to evaluate the status of the species, which then led to that proposal or the decision in 2020 that monarchs warranted listing, but were precluded due to other higher priority needs at that time. Now, 4 years later, here we are. Last week, we saw the proposal for monarch butterfly being proposed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. And it's this graph here that we've all probably seen many times before, showing the eastern population declines that really motivated interest and engagement in things like the Monarch CCAA, the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. And so just want to illustrate this as a point that we've been seeing these declines for some time, and here with the previous winter having the second lowest overwintering numbers, we're now with this proposal. So no surprise to those involved with monarch conservation, some of those primary decision influences on that are things like the lack of milkweed and flowering nectar plants available for monarchs, the degradation of overwintering habitat, thinking primarily of the Western population and in California. Obviously threats like insecticide exposure or pesticide exposure more generally as it relates to habitat loss relative to certain uses. And then also, of course, the effects of climate change, making all of these other stressors all the worse. And so with the updated evaluation, looking at a high probability of extinction for the monarch butterfly within the next 60 years is really leading to that proposal that we saw that the monarch is proposed for listing as threatened with a 4D rule under the Endangered Species Act. And one point I think you'll see as we talk through what this listing proposal entails, as well as what it means for the CCAA, is that 4D rule in particular is really designed to encourage conservation and to encourage engagement and participation in conservation for monarchs. And of course, that benefits all sorts of other species as well. And so you'll see that, I think, in some of the language of that proposed rule as we go through this. So to share a little bit more about that, right, the proposed 4D rule allows exceptions to the typical prohibitions for take that are offered under the Endangered Species Act that come through Section 9. And so those exceptions, again, are there to encourage conservation, to incentivize people to engage and support monarchs and other species in particular. And so looking at ways to increase milkweed and nectar plants, protect those overwintering grounds, especially in California for the Western population, and then also support just the public collaboration towards monarch conservation. We've often referred to the monarch conservation world to the all hands on deck approach. That's truly what monarchs need to be recovered to a point where listing doesn't have to be a consideration. And so those exceptions are really intended, again, to incentivize conservation and practices, broadly speaking. And so I want to speak a little bit to some of the exceptions and particularly how they relate to energy and transportation infrastructure and management. So if you've looked at these, some of these might be familiar, but this first one being broadly activities that maintain, enhance, remove, and establish milkweed nectar plants within the breeding and migratory range that do not result in conversion of native or naturalized grassland, shrubland, or forested habitats. And then this includes a series of activities that you see in those sub-bullets below habitat and restoration management activities, livestock grazing and routine ranching activities, routine agricultural activities, fire management activities, silviculture, and forest management best management practices. Any type of vegetation management activities that occur at times of year when monarchs aren't present, and then of course maintenance, removal, establishing milkweed nectar plants on residential properties. And so these combine both conservation focused needs for monarchs as well as activities that are considered to have sort of a de minimis effect in terms of meeting those conservation objectives. Another exemption that was included is the implementation of comprehensive conservation plans and programs where plans meet these criteria for comprehensively addressing threats, establishing measurable objectives, demonstrating that capability and funding available to maintain programs, having an adaptive management strategy, and then monitoring for effectiveness and compliance. Other exemptions that were included include maintenance and improvement of overwintering habitat using service approved plans for those sites, exemptions for vehicle strikes, exemptions for non-lethal collection, possession, scientific research, possession of dead monarchs, as well as sale of captively reared monarchs. That limited number, typically with a threshold of about 250 butterflies, as noted in the proposed rule. In addition to those proposed 4D exemptions, there's also proposed critical habitat. And so critical habitat is proposed for those overwintering groves in coastal California. There's 62 overwintering sites that are comprised across 7 units, as you can see in the map shown here. Each of those units contains a subset of sites as shown in that smaller inset. And each of these sites includes that core zone where the overwintering sort of roosts occur, the shelter zone around that that's protecting those areas, and then the support zone that's offering that nectar plant and those resources immediately adjacent to those sites. One thing I want to highlight as we go through this is that there is some specific areas noted in the proposed rule that are of interest, I think, to infrastructure managers, where there is service requested input on different considerations, both for the proposed 4D provisions as well as the proposed critical habitat. And so thinking about, again, how do we incentivize conservation while also supporting infrastructure management is, I think, the goal that's aiming for with some of these exceptions. And so looking at, as you're thinking about public comment for your own organization, as we think about that for the Rights Ways Habitat Working Group, how can we balance the conservation need along with some of these exceptions for maintenance, enhancement, removal, and establishment of milkweed? And are there other considerations for the timing or other deferments included when we think about exceptions for pesticides, especially on rights of ways and other infrastructure where we use herbicides quite a bit, that obviously in certain uses can impact habitat, but in other uses can actually help benefit and improve habitat. How do we strike that balance in a final 4D rule for something like that? There's other considerations for direct impacts, right? There's an exception there for vehicle strikes, but there's consideration there for mortality from things like wind turbines, and how is that considered? And last, how can the 4D itself encourage that participation, that engagement in conservation? On the proposed critical habitat, thinking about the range of those critical habitat areas across the US. Again, these are focused on a subset of those known overwintering populations in California currently. So getting input on that. So if you kind of lay this out on a spectrum, you've been thinking about what this means for energy and transportation uses and management of those lands. And I think we have the spectrum of activities that are clearly exempt on one hand, clearly prohibited on the other, and then some in the middle that are unclear that will, I think, require clarification as we look ahead. And so certainly, on the left side, clearly exempt activities include those that are done under that comprehensive planning exemption, that exemption number 2 that we talked about. Certainly, vegetation management that's done at times of year when monarchs are not present is also exempted. That's in that first exemption under sub-item G. Activities that promote conservation, especially invasive species control and habitat restoration efforts, are also obviously exempted under one of that first provision, and also vehicle strikes. On the other end, we think about things that are clearly prohibited. We have any form of take that is not exempted by those 4D provisions. And so you think about typical take for harm, harass, killing, trapping, capturing, as well as possession, sale, and transfer of the species that's not exempted. There is obviously then conversion of monarch habitat, that trying to, conversion of habitat, not just from, think about from a habitat type use to a developed use, a non-habitat cover type essentially. And in the middle, we have those unclear areas that I would say, are really, from our perspective, where we think public comment would really be of value. And so I want to encourage you to think about that as we're looking ahead to this public comment period and as we think about the implications for management. And so we think about routine vegetation management activities that might sustain or enhance butterfly habitat. How does that, that's unclear how that is handled currently in the 4D from our perspective. We think about routine vegetation management activities that may negatively impact the availability of milkweed and nectar plants, or maybe temporarily impact that versus ones that might sustain or enhance those. And so the line of where that's drawn is unclear from our perspective at this time. It is something that, again, I think getting input from industry, from conservation organizations, and from others to weigh in on what's appropriate for exemptions versus not, I think would be really, really helpful there. And I think as an energy and transportation managers, as you're looking at this, thinking about that there is some uncertainty there and maybe some clarity that needs to be lended there. And so we think about that, we look at those exemptions, there's that one exemption for comprehensive plans. And so we've already received that question, does the Monarch CCAA qualify under that exemption? And while it looks at face value like it would, it actually doesn't. And so one interesting aspect of that is that if you look at the details of the proposed rule, it's for implementation of those plans developed by or in coordination with a state agency or developed by the federal agency, in particular with the 7A1A or 7A1 provisions within the Endangered Species Act. I will say though, this is where then the Monarch CCAA itself comes with an enhancement of survival permit, and that enhancement of survival permit does broadly authorize take resulting from conservation measures, but also the operations, maintenance, and modernization that's detailed in that agreement. So while it doesn't qualify for an exemption, many of those activities that we've talked about do have coverage through that permit in the program. So I'll let Megan talk a little bit more about what that means for the Monarch CCAA itself and considerations you might want to take there. But before I do that, it's worth thinking about, well, what is the value? What's the conservation value of the CCAA? I mean, certainly there's the regulatory mechanism that is underpinning it, but it was motivated by conservation. We started this program 5 years ago. We've seen a lot of engagement since, and that engagement of infrastructure in conservation, I think, has been a major shift that we've seen in those past 5 years, and largely through this program. We've seen that incentivizing conservation as an operational objective that feeds into sustainability efforts and others across industries. That engagement that we've seen both within companies and agencies within their teams across veg management, environmental, and maybe leadership, but also with external partners, with researchers, with community organizations, with conservation groups has really been phenomenal. So you take all that, we also have the tracking, the monitoring, those commitments that are made through the Monarch CCAA that get reported back to the university and ultimately to Fish and Wildlife Service on an annual basis that provides a really robust governance structure of having that third-party review of the results of that conservation efforts that then can feed back into the conservation considerations for monarchs. And so as the service is going through their decision-making for the monarch butterfly, this can help support their review according to the policy for evaluation of conservation efforts. And then following listing, it can be incorporated into recovery planning and considerations for the butterfly going forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan. I do want to pause shortly though, I mentioned earlier, we do have a lot of our service counterparts on the call. I just want to invite Lori or any others if you would like to share any other updates on what I shared here. Feel free to chime in.
Hey everybody, I'm Lori Nordstrom, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our Midwest Regional Office. Part of the team that had the lead for this Monarch ESA decision. We got a couple others on here. I don't have anything to add right now, Dan. You did a really good job of summarizing. So I don't know if you want to introduce a couple of the Fish and Wildlife Service people that are on, because I know Jake's not available for very long.
Oh, sure, certainly. Yeah, so to, I guess, introduce a few others here, and Lori, just make sure I have everybody here. Jake Lee, who's now in headquarters, and I'm sorry, Jake, I don't, Director of Operations, is that the new title?
No, I'm the, no worries. I'm the, hi everyone. I'm the new Assistant Director for Ecological Services. Basically oversee a program that oversees national implementation of the Endangered Species Act. So great to be here.
Thank you, Jake. Thanks. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us here as well. And congratulations on the new role too.
Thank you.
And then we're also joined, I believe, by Phil Delphi. Phil Delphi has been a long time involved with the Monarch CCAA program. So many of you involved with that program know Phil well.
We also have Karen Harrington, who is our Ecological Services Program Lead. She's actually Phil's boss, so she wanted to listen in on this too. So she's here too. She can help learn and answer questions.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you all for joining. I was going to have Megan share a little more about the Monarch CCAA, and then we'll take some time for question and answers here towards the end. But yeah, thank you all for joining. All right, well, Megan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, coming off of what Dan was talking about with going through the proposed Monarch listing, we also wanted to touch on how that affects the Monarch Canada Conservation Agreement. And so we'll be going over more of how the Monarch CCAA, how that aligns with the 4D rule and what's been proposed there, as well as critical habitat and what that means for those within or interested in joining the program. Then also some enrollment and compliance considerations. Yeah, for anyone who is already in the Monarch CCAA or is interested in enrolling. For those of you who are maybe less familiar with the Monarch CCAA, it is a voluntary conservation program under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. So it has been approved in April of 2020, and it has been accepting applications since then. And so we have around 68 applications received to date, with a variety of different energy organizations, utilities, DOTs, different counties that have enrolled to date. And that includes around 7.1 million acres enrolled, with a lot of those organizations going above and beyond what is required of the program to contribute or are already actively managing a little over 1 million monarch habitat acres. And you can see in the map there, that's all the different states that we've received applications for or have already enrolled those organizations in, with just a couple last states missing there. So really neat to see that as well has grown over the years. So once that was approved in April of 2020, that did result in a couple different things coming out of that. So, you know, this is to answer the question, what are ESA regulatory assurances? So that approval of the Monarch CCAA came with this enhancement of survival permit, which is a permit that UIC administers. And so we admit and enroll new organizations under that permit. There's also the biological opinion that accompanies this agreement to ensure that there is that conservation happening and there is that benefit happening to the species, to the monarch butterfly. And then also those assurances that the service will not require additional or different activities. So whatever has been agreed upon within the Monarch CCAA, those organizations receive that assurances, no matter what the monarch listing contains, and that's kind of the real benefit of what has come out of the Monarch CCAA. So those assurances include 3 different categories that we've summarized under operations, maintenance, and modernization. Operations are those normal day-to-day use of either the highway or the lines or facilities for these energy and transportation organizations. Emergency response, access needs, typical operation requirements for our partners, and then maintenance, so vegetation maintenance. So anywhere they're not doing that conservation work, they have those assurances that they can do their typical vegetation management needs, any maintenance repairs, facility maintenance, storage, and then also modernization. So if there's already existing road or bridge or line that needs repair or expanding, that is also included. But what is not included is new construction. So that would be something that would need to be included in the normal permit request of Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's something that is not included in the CCAA. So comparing what is included in the 4D rule, the proposed 4D rule, and then what's also included in the Monarch CCAA, we compare here what is exempted and then what is covered under the CCAA. So our interpretation so far is that vegetation management when monarchs are not present is something that's included in that 4D rule and normal vehicle equipment use. But as Dan was saying, there is some uncertainty, so that's where those question marks come in for things like targeted vegetation management and herbicide use and different maintenance. But those things are explicitly included under the CCAA and are allowed. And then also from our interpretation, we believe that replacement, rebuilding, and upgrading facilities, and then also construction is not included in that 4D rule. And under the CCAA, that, as I mentioned, the modernization activities, replacement, rebuilding, that is something that's also explicitly allowed under the CCAA, but new construction is not. So I think this is a helpful thing to kind of compare where we're at currently with this proposed listing and then what's allowed under the CCAA. Something that we've also gotten some question on is critical habitat and what that means for the CCAA. So overwintering sites are excluded from coverage under the agreement. So that's something that will continue to remain the same even as the proposed rule becomes finalized. So if there is overwintering sites or critical habitat on your land, you do not receive that coverage to be able to, cut them down or anything like that. So adopted acres within a half mile of those overwintering sites are still required to maintain and avoid removing flowering nectar plants. That is something that is already in the Monarch CCAA. Even as critical habitat designations become available for the monarch. Something to note that it would be great to report all Western monarch observations, including breeding via the Western monarch milkweed mapper on iNaturalist. So that's something to look out for people operating in those states with overwintering sites. And the CCAA does not constitute a site-specific service-approved overwintering sites land management plan, so that will still need to be done as critical habitat becomes available. The CCAA requirements are, staying the same for those of you enrolled or planning to enroll. Partners are still required to implement conservation measures and track where those conservation measures are, conduct the monitoring for milkweed stems and nectar coverage, and then on a yearly basis report what that monitoring activities, what data was collected through that, what conservation measures, what was able to be accomplished over the past year. That will still be submitted to UIC and continue to support the program through yearly admin fees. So these are things that have stayed the same and have always been a requirement in the CCA. So this listing proposal does not change those commitments or compliance requirements. That's the benefit of the CCA, is you have a lot of certainty throughout this process. One thing to note is that once that final listing rule does become effective, that enhancement of survival permit that we have been implementing and administering does become effective. So those assurances become effective. That's something that organizations will utilize as that final rule becomes effective. And also there is in the CCA a line about coordinating with federal land management agencies. So partners, as needed, will need to notify the federal land agencies. Department of Defense or the National Park Service, those sorts of entities, and then request any agency input for the activities on those lands. If the organization does respond, coordinate as necessary. So partners only need to notify these organizations. That does not mean additional permission or approval beyond notifying. So you may be wondering how long you do have to enroll if you're not already. So we have up until that effective listing date. So as these things typically take a year, we anticipate that being early 2026. So after the public comment period, and then any sort of adjustments that need to be made after that, and then that final listing rule is set, there will be usually about a month from that final listing rule for that effective date. So after that, organizations can no longer submit applications to us. You do not need to be fully enrolled, but there could be that space between when you submit your application and when we can include you under the permit, so review your application and officially enroll you. So we do recommend submitting that application sooner rather than later to avoid any sort of gap in coverage. And then once you're enrolled, you can still add, transfer, remove lands from your certificate of inclusion. So you can expand your enrollment over time or change your enrollment as different needs come along. You can also transfer or change ownership of those lands and they can receive coverage. So all those requests just need to be submitted to us at UIC via a certificate of inclusion modification request form. So yeah, you can enroll a small amount and then change that over time. And then also to note, if a partner does terminate their certificate of inclusion post-listing, so post that effective date, there's no ability to re-enroll. So something else to keep in mind. And so with that, I think I'm passing it over to Mine for questions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Megan. I think that's a helpful summary. Hopefully gets people thinking here about what the CCAA does and what it provides in light of where we're at with the proposed rule. But yeah, now we want to take some time to answer some of the questions. I see we have a number of questions in the chat. So thank you to those who've submitted that already. And if you have other questions, please add those in. We'll try to answer as many as we can and respond with those that we won't get to. But yeah, Caroline, do you want to kind of walk us through what we have questions-wise?
Yeah, and Dan and Megan, you want to show your faces again as well so we can see you both? Okay, so the first question that we got was about monitoring, which is a requirement of the CCAA. So with the proposed listing, how do you suggest CCAA partners instruct consultants to survey for milkweed/nectar plants? You've got a 11-mile stretch of road widening and culvert addition, and the consultant wanted to know how many survey plots they should incorporate into their biological evaluation. What would you tell them?
Sure. Well, there's maybe a couple ways to answer that. And, I would say, in thinking of the proposal, if you're trying to evaluate the potential for habitat, then certainly doing a number of plots along something like an 11-mile stretch would be useful. There's certainly a lot of tools for that. Through the Rights Ways Habitat Working Group, we have a pollinator habitat scorecard that's intended to be sort of a rapid assessment of habitat that can be helpful. There's also a lot of development happening in the world of drones and remote sensing that can also potentially help scenarios like that. So if you're looking to characterize for potential effects or impacts in light of a listing proposal, that would be, any of those tools could be useful in that regard. For the Monarch CCAA, we do have a protocol within the CCAA itself that does walk through the specifics as far as the number of plots, the random selection of them, and so on for CCAA compliance. And so section 14 of the Monarch CCAA is where you can find all those details if you'd like to learn more about that.
Thank you, Dan. And maybe you can also speak to quickly triggering adaptive management as well.
Sure. So in reference to monitoring within the Monarch CCAA, there are set targets that we're aiming for on adopted acres in terms of what we would like to see from a milkweed and nectar plant perspective. That again comes out of the biological opinion, supporting the fact that this is a net benefit as a result of all the conservation commitments happening through the CCAA. And so if those targets aren't met through monitoring, that's when the CCAA can trigger essentially adaptive management, which basically means as a partner, we want you to consider what are things that you can do to ensure good milkweed and nectar plant conservation on your adopted acres. In some cases, it might be maybe changing your approach to monitoring, taking more sampling points because the random selection of plot locations maybe doesn't always pick up where milkweed occurs since it can be so variable on the landscape. It could be thinking about incorporating things like milkweed and nectar plants into seed mixes, undertaking variations of conservation measures. We just ask you to consider that and think about that as you're sort of implementing your involvement in the program.
Thank you. Okay, Megan, you spoke to this a little bit already, but just refresh us. Critical habitats are not included in the Monarch CCAA, therefore consultation is required if a federal action will affect critical habitat, correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, as I spoke to, critical habitat is not something that's included in the CCAA, so that's excluded, and so a normal consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service is required.
Thank you.
I will just add to that briefly, and I welcome Lori or others from the service that they would like to chime in on this as well. But right, if there's another federal action that also is a covered activity within the Monarch CCAA, that action still requires consultation in accordance with Section 7. Now, being enrolled in the Monarch CCAA, the fact that there's a biological opinion there, that can make that determination for that consultation more streamlined and straightforward. But the CCAA does not de-obligate you from Section 7 and other agencies' compliance to that. Lori, did you want to add to that?
I don't have anything to add. Phil Delphi is a Section 7 expert, and I was just messaging him to see if he had anything to add. I think you did a good summary.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think that was a good summary. I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Great, thanks, Phil.
Thank you all. Okay, Megan, can you tell us a little bit about the administrative fees that are associated with enrolling in the CCAA?
Yeah, so it's based off of your adopted acres, and that's something that is paid on a yearly basis, or we can work with a schedule that works for you. So that is an admin fee that supports the work that we all do. So the different guidance documents and webinars and other support that we provide to our partners, coordinating with Fish and Wildlife Service, different conferences that we go to. So that supports that work. And that's something that that is a requirement in order to be enrolled in the Monarch CCAA.
I will just
Thank
add
you.
too, if people are interested in learning more about the fee, if you go on the Monarch CCAA toolkit, you can actually download the fee calculator and see what a fee would be for a certain amount of adopted acres.
And yeah, we're also happy to provide quotes for you as well if you want to reach out to me about that.
Dan, does this apply to private property or only public property, the CCAA?
So the CCAA can be rolled by energy and transportation entities that are managing vegetation on lands that are used for those purposes, right? So that can include, well, being a CCAA, it's a Section 10 agreement, which is an agreement with a non-federal entity. But that said, there are a lot of non-federal easements on state and federal lands, right? So think of a, let's say a pipeline operator or a power line company that might have rights of ways that intersect national forests or state parks. Those easements can be enrolled in the Monarch CCAA, even though the underlying land is a public land. And so there's I guess a complicated answer to that, but essentially the CCAA is for non-federal entities that can be easements, leases, or fee-owned lands that are enrolled.
So thank you. Fish and Wildlife Service, this one I think may be better for you to answer. Do you believe that the upcoming administration change will impact the CCAA or this effort? Or if you can't, we can conjecture as well.
We can't answer that. We're going to be working, we're part of that administration, so we will be working with them. So, so we don't know.
I will just say, I mean, the CCAA was approved under the previous Trump administration. Since its beginnings, it's had broad bipartisan support, you know, through both parties. And so I guess I don't see any aspects of the administration change changing the value or the structure or any aspects of the Monarch CCAA at this time.
Yeah, I guess if I wasn't realizing, maybe you're asking about the CCAA right now as officially signed. I can't imagine that's a signed agreement. I can't imagine that changing, you know, but going forward, other discussions, that's what we'll be a part of that administration and move forward with that administration.
Laurie, while I have you, does Fish and Wildlife have a court-ordered submittal date to the Federal Register for the Monarch final rule, as the proposed rule did?
No, so the court order was just that we have a finding submitted to the Federal Register by December 4th of 2024. And by statute in the Endangered Species Act, it says that 12 months later, we will have a final decision after a proposed rule, but there isn't any court settlement.
Thank you. Okay, 2 questions about the 4D. So is mowing of already mowed areas covered by the 4D rule, and why isn't the enrollment in the CCAA included as a 4D exemption for DOTs? Will a comment be made by UIC for it to be included, for it to be as an included exemption in the final?
Sure, maybe I'll take an initial, you know, take at the mowing question, and then the second part. I guess, is mowing of already mowed areas covered under the 4D exemption? I suppose there might be a question of how frequently mowed it is. If it's a turf area that is, you know, frequently mowed and there's really no habitat there, then there's really no reason for it to be covered. It's not habitat, and so there wouldn't likely be take. If it's a, let's say, less frequently mowed, maybe a few times a year where it can sustain habitat, but mowing is used maybe to remove woody species or control particular species, I think that's one of those areas that is unclear at this point. You know, whether or not that is sustaining habitat, that's part of habitat restoration or not. I think that's where the service is looking for comments. But Lori, I see you nodding, so I'll let you fill in.
You guys are doing great. I would like to enlist you to do all the other webinars and conversations that we're having with all kinds of other interested folks. But just keep in mind, as what Dan said early on about the 4D rule, what our goal was to get people to leave milkweed in particular on the landscape, to let it grow, restore it, keep it there. So like with the mowing, if there's already milkweed mowed down or the nectar plants are mowed down, you're not going to have monarchs there probably. It's going to be really unusual. So so the idea that part of the proposed 4D says vegetation management activities such as mowing that remove milkweed and or nectar plants when conducted at times of the year when monarchs are not present. So again, the goal is to keep milkweed and nectar plants on the landscape.
Yeah. And then in response to that second part of the question about, why isn't the CCAA considered as part of the exemption, and do we plan on making a comment? I'd say we're evaluating that. That is something we've already started discussions with service about that exemption and how does the CCAA relate to that. On some level, there's that permit coverage that's already included there, and so to some extent, I don't know that an exemption really would change anything from that standpoint. That in terms of the covered activities and the work that's being done to that agreement. And so, but that's something we'll continue to discuss and see if that warrants a comment like that. And I don't know, Lori, if you wanted to.
I would reiterate that too, that I think is part of the reason that you all developed the CCAA was to provide that regulatory predictability and assurances over the long term. And so no matter what the 4D rule says or ends up saying in a final, you've got the coverage and certainty of that CCAA. But definitely all of this, we really want to hear more public comment, especially from the expertise here on the call, because as I said, monarchs occur in 48 states, and milkweed can occur all different kinds of places. And so we are trying to navigate a 4D rule that encourages people to keep milkweed on the landscape, while also realizing we're talking about all different kinds of sectors and activities. So I know we didn't get it perfect in this first go around, so comment will help.
Thank you. I have two questions about covered activities actually now. So can you clarify what the covered activities are? And then there's concern, somebody thinks that they heard that the CCAA covered activities are not included as part of the 4D rule. Can you clarify a little bit on both of those?
Sure. So I just put back the slide that summarizes the covered activities, generally speaking. So if you do want to see what covered activities are and how they're described, if you read the CCAA, that's described in section 5 of that agreement. So that would include, again, this broad array of operations, maintenance, and what we call modernization, which is really kind of a catch-all term for rebuilding, repairing, replacing, upgrading existing facilities. And so that that covers quite a bit of activities right there. I guess in terms of, are we concerned that those are not exempt? Again, I would say we're not concerned about that, just because, again, the permit that's issued along with the Monarch CCAA, that as a CCAA partner is included under that permit through their certificate of inclusion, it provides that incidental take coverage for all those activities. And so again, I must say that exemption isn't needed at that point, but essentially you have permit coverage at that point.
Thank you. Do all CCAA participants need to notify federal agencies even if their land is not within the federal agency's land?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so the notification for federal agencies requirement, if Monarch is listed, right? So that is for lands that are enrolled in the Monarch CCAA. So if you have a right-of-way or a road that intersects a national forest, yes, we would want you to notify that national forest. let them know you're enrolled in the Monarch CCAA. And it's simply that. It's simply a notification to try to encourage coordination, collaboration as it relates to monarch conservation. So it gives them a chance to be aware that you're enrolled, that you're doing things for monarchs, and to build a connection there. Beyond the notification, if you don't receive a response, you can continue to operate as you need. But again, coming back to the question, it doesn't mean you have to notify every federal agency, even if you don't have intersections on your enrolled lands with them. So it's just those federal lands and agencies that you intersect with in your enrollment.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left of questions. We are receiving some really incredible questions. We will follow up on any that we do not get a chance to respond to, and so keep adding them in. Next question is, if the monarch is uplisted to endangered, does the CCAA still provide the same provisions and protections?
Sure. Some people might recall we did an article on LinkedIn about this recently, back in September, thinking ahead to this moment. And certainly in the future, there could still be changes to the monarch status over time, right? The population continues to decline. It might warrant an uplisting to endangered. And I do think from a industry perspective, this is, again, a big value of the CCAA, not just from the conservation perspective that we can continue to add that conservation for the species, but then you have that certainty that if there is an uplisting or a change of some sort, even in 4D provisions, the CCAA permit provides that consistency, that certainty, no matter what. And Lori, you can say something?
Can I add another thing that there's, as many of you know, we get litigated, Fish and Wildlife Service gets litigated over a lot of our listing decisions, and so it wouldn't be surprise me whatever the final monarch decision is, that we might get litigated. And that's what another place where the CCAA provides that long-term assurances and predictability, no matter what happens with litigation over a final decision. So that's where it helps.
Yeah.
Laurie, I have a follow-up slide after this, and you're stealing the words right out of my mouth and saying it better than I could, so thank you for that. How is new construction distinguished from expanding existing facilities, pipelines, electric lines, you name it?
Okay, I would say, so new construction, the line between new construction and modernization is focused on, again, that repair, upgrading, replacement of existing facilities. And so there is some amount of expansion that's allowed in that, understanding that, if you're upgrading a pipe from, a 12-inch to a 36-inch, maybe there's wider diameters needed for easements and rights of ways, but you're replacing something that's already there, that's allowed. When we get into, and it has to also, per the kind of clarifications within the CCAA, right? It has to result in no or negligible environmental impacts, right? So if it's something that it's a huge expansion or increase that requires, large other environmental impacts, that would essentially exceed what's allowed under modernization. So it is intended for those, I'd say, more routine kind of upgrades and replacements. The new construction is really differentiated by being on newly acquired, undeveloped lands, have the absence of infrastructure on them. And so using those as sort of the distinctions between those two, certainly we're always here and available to help, as is the service. If people are wondering if a particular project or activity, falls on the line of modernization or new construction.
Okay, last question for today, at least. Can Fish and Wildlife explain or define conversion as noted in the first element of the 4D?
That is exactly a place where we would like public input on how you would recommend or how you would need clarification on what do we mean by conversion. You can tell when you've obviously read the rule, like, we don't speak exactly to what that is. Our general intent was like permanent conversion into non-habitat at all, impervious surfaces, but it would be very helpful to get comment about how we should clarify or what you think it should be.
Thank you. Okay, so as I said before, we will follow up with any questions that were not answered. Thank you to everyone, Dan, Megan, Lori for answering questions, and Phil for answering questions. Looking forward to what is next. You can go to the next slide. Really just, you know, we're talking about the nuances of the CCAA, but I think it's really important to end this conversation highlighting that this has been a bipartisan project from the beginning. It's had support from the beginning. It was created by more than 45 partners, you know, energy companies, transportation agencies, federal agencies, all working together to create this really incredible program. And I think it's really something that should be applauded. Everyone's contributions to it should be applauded. It has been applauded in the America the Beautiful reporting as an example of valuable contributions of voluntary conservation efforts. Department of Interior recognized this agreement in Senator Merkley's Monarch Summit in 2022 and gave that award that you see in the top left corner. And we are standing on the shoulders of giants in the creation of this agreement by creating a companion agreement for at-risk bumblebee species. And so that conservation benefit agreement is currently undergoing review by the service. We're hoping for approval in 2025. And this is something that I think we can all point to as saying that it's having an impact. It is, you know, nationally worked towards, and it's really incredible. And you know, it's been 5 years since the approval of this agreement, and just to see what has been done by our partners is really fantastic. So thank you to everybody that has contributed to this agreement and to serving the monarch. That being said, and this goes back to what Lori was saying. So we've got this proposed rule in 2024. We are looking for the Thanksgiving count, the overwintering count. Fish and Wildlife Service is hoping to get comments from you for the next 90 days. This will all impact the final rule. We do not know what that final rule will look like. And we don't know what it's going to look like beyond the final rule. Of course, there's litigation, like Lori mentioned. There's changing interpretations of it. We never know what's going to happen with the monarch population. And so it's really important to think about the CCAA, or it's crucial to think about the CCAA as providing this stability and certainty for operations, for your organization's regulatory approach. It's reducing that business risk, and of course, maybe most important in the monarch's eyes, it is creating a massive conservation benefit. And so you know, we're always happy to talk about the CCAA and get into it with everybody, because we think it's such an important tool for organizations across the United States to use. As we've mentioned now a couple of times, there's 90 days for public comment period. This is a crucial point in the listing proposal. We encourage you to submit your comments. If you have any questions about the comments, please reach out to us, to Fish and Wildlife Service, but we hope that you all take some time to submit comments and read that 4D as well. Just a few more things that we wanted to remind everybody about. So, you know, part of what this agreement is about is, you know, cross-national participation and conservation. We are hosting another meeting with the Monarch Joint Venture again this summer. And it is in Minneapolis. It is the North American Monarch Summit. We've got focused sessions on energy and transport for infrastructure, energy and transportation, navigating the ESA, conservation agreements, things like that. And it's we hope that you all can make it. We've got early bird pricing until February 16th, so please join us for that. And of course, that's not all, because we never stop with just one. We are also hosting with our partners below the Biodiversity and Nature in Energy and Transportation Conference. So that is focused on nature-based solutions, helping connect people with improved tracking and reporting, making biodiversity and sustainability relevant in operations. And we've got the save the date out now, and registration should be open soon. And then finally, so don't leave me just yet, we do host a bi-monthly meeting for those industry representatives that have either enrolled in the agreement or are interested in enrolling in the agreement. So if you are interested in joining us for those bi-monthly meetings and you are an industry representative, please reach out to Megan for more information. Our next meeting will be February 6th. We hope you have very happy holidays, and the next slide has all of our contact information. So if you have any questions